Hi,
We'll go,
folks. Ray Deeser here. Yeah.
Hi, Ray. We'll go ahead and get started. Um, and we'll let some stragglers come in as well as needed. So good afternoon. My name is Tamara Johnson-Yellen. I'm an associate professor at Bridgewater College and a member of the Virginia chapter's IDEA Committee, which stands for Increasing Diversity, Equity, and Awareness in the Wildlife Profession. And I'm joined today with my committee colleague, Jeff Trollinger, who's going to talk to us about his experience and lessons learned working with the sovereign nations of Virginia. Jeff has worked with or for the Department of Wildlife Resources since 1987, where he began his undergraduate at Virginia Tech. He's originally from Luray, has a BS in Wildlife Management from Tech, and a second BS in Human Resource Management from Bluefield College. In addition, he has a graduate certificate from the University of Wisconsin River Falls in wildlife recreation and nature tourism. He helped develop DWR's Watchable Wildlife Program and managed the program for 10 years. He led the team that developed the Virginia Birding and Wildlife Trail. He led the development of the major portions of the agency's Inclusive Excellence Strategic Plan and the DWR's Wildlife Viewing Plan. In addition to managing the Watchable Wildlife Program, he served as the Deputy Director for the agency's Bureau of Wildlife Resources for 8 years, and as the Assistant Chief of the Aquatic Resources Division for 5 years, in addition to recently taking on the next revision of the Virginia Wildlife Action Plan. He's co-authored several publications for which he's received awards, both regional and national, and he co-edited a publication with the Colorado Division of Wildlife on wildlife viewing and photography blinds. Jeff is married to a wonderful husband, and they have four-legged children who you may hear in the background in the wilds of Goochland County, and they're currently working on building their retirement home in Nelson County. So I will turn it over to Jeff, and excuse me, if you have questions, pardon me, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and I will facilitate that at the end of the talk, or you can wait and chime in towards the end. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Tamara. How's everybody doing today? I'm glad to see everybody. I'm in very large company I see on the screen, so I will get started. As you can see from my title slide, there actually is a rhyme and reason to this title slide. The 7 tribes across the top of the slide are the Monacans, the Pamunkey, the Chickahominy, the Eastern Division of the Chickahominy, the Rappahannock, the Upper Mattaponi, and the Nansemond. Those are the 7 federally recognized tribes that we have in Virginia. The 4 tribes that are down the sides, the Mattaponi, the Cherahonic, I always have to work on that word, the Nottoway, and the Patawomac are state-recognized tribes. And then the 5 across the bottom, which are the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, the Catawba, the Saponi, the Occaneechi, and the Shawnee, have a traditional presence in the state at some point and still have some tribal organization left. So there are lots of tribes and lots of ways to think about this. So I just wanted to sort of demonstrate that on the title slide. I start this talk with a massive disclaimer, and I do say this massively. I am not a member of any of the tribes, and even according to Ancestry DNA, I have no Native American heredity, which is in complete opposition to what every Southern family hears about having Cherokee blood in their background, and we have heard that story in our family as well. But as far as I can tell, there is no proof to that. The information I am sharing is from my own learning and my own experience in working with the tribes. It in no way fully represents the journey the tribes have taken over the last 400 years or more since colonization began. And the information presented here is as accurate as I can make it, but if anybody sees any inaccuracies, I would very much appreciate hearing about them. So please let me know. So in this vein, let me get started. There are only 2 tribes that have persisted with land in Virginia from colonial time to today. And those are the Mattaponi and the Pamunkey. And I caution you, do not confuse the Mattaponi and the Upper Mattaponi. They are 2 separate tribes. They both maintained a small reservation throughout the period. They both, by treaty, pay taxes to the governor, which I'm sure you've seen on the news every Thanksgiving. and they both maintained state recognition throughout, but no federal recognition. There were other tribes that have persisted in the Commonwealth, but had no land holdings or official recognition. So tribes like the Monacans withdrew to the mountains from their traditional Piedmont lands to escape the colonial incursions that were occurring. In Virginia, the tribes are made up sort of two groups, if you will. There were the Powhatan nations, which was made up of over 30 tribes, and I will not even begin to try to pronounce most of these because my pronunciation would just massacre them. But you'll notice that a lot of the tribe names are things that we are familiar with today. So names like Chesapeake and Accomack and Appomattox and Potomac are all tribal names that were maintained over the centuries. In addition to the Powhatan Confederacy nations, there were a variety of other tribes that have a cultural presence from colonial times till today that have persisted. These were tribes that were never part of the Powhatan Confederacy, and many, like the Cherokee, the Shawnee, and the Iroquois, withdrew from Virginia completely over the years. Many of the tribes, like the Saponi, the Occaneechi, and the Tutelo, either partially or completely merged in with the Monacans. So they still exist, but not as named or recognized tribes in Virginia to this day. To give you some sort of geographical perspective, the groups of tribes, most of our tribes today in Virginia were tidal tribes. Most of these were part of the Powhatan Confederacy. The tribes in Virginia spoke predominantly 3 languages. The coastal tribes all spoke Algonquin. The Monacans and the Piedmont tribes all spoke Siouan. And the Cherokee and the Iroquois had their own languages. So to this day, many of the folks in these tribes are still speakers. Well, I won't say many, but they do have speakers of the original languages in all of the tribes. As I said, there are still there are now 7 federally recognized tribes in Virginia. I'll talk a little bit about how they get there in a minute. Most of the tidal tribes have a presence on the tidal rivers, and so they're predominantly interested in water quality issues and herring and shad hatchery assistance. These are all predominantly, I put these out there because these are where we look for opportunities for the agency to start partnering with these tribes. And so I have listed some things that are of importance or that we have already had conversations about with some of the tribes. The Monacans, being our only inland recognized tribe, are interested more in other things in terms of hunting leases, forest management, and whitetail deer programs. So to give you a little history, in the past, all but the Mattaponi and Pamunkey had pretty much lost all of their reservation lands by 1878. And all the Western tribes have been pushed out of the current Virginia boundaries. Remember that for many of these past years, West Virginia and Virginia were one state. In 1924, the Virginia Racial Integrity Act was passed. This was particularly important to the Virginia tribes because basically what it did was it determined and set aside the fact that if you weren't white, you were colored in Virginia under the Virginia Racial Integrity Act, which meant that the Indian ancestry records were all pretty much destroyed at this point. And that will come in to be more important as we go a little bit farther in this discussion, and I will explain why. So they had no documentation of their heritage after this point. And the Racial Integrity Act stayed on the books until 1967, when the court case Loving versus Virginia ruled on by the U.S. Supreme Court. And in that court case, it ruled that discriminating against anyone due to race was illegal under the Constitution, and as such, it made things like interracial marriage legal, but it also said that other groups were entitled to be treated as equals as it related to official policy by the state of Virginia and by all the states since it was a Supreme Court ruling. Hence, the Racial Integrity Act was deemed unconstitutional, and at this point, the tribes had the ability to again start looking at getting their records amended. But the problem was that there wasn't any record left in many cases for them to use as documentation. So after that court ruling, the process of recognition of the Virginia tribes started. And you'll see that in 1968, the Rappahannock tribe petitioned the federal government for recognition. Interestingly enough, the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the federal government lost that request at some point. Starting in the late or early 80s, the tribes again started looking for official recognition. There are two ways that our tribes can get federal recognition. One is through the administrative process with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And in this particular case, and this is where it becomes important, they have to produce records of their heritage and the members of their tribe, which, of course, as I already mentioned, they couldn't do for a long period of Virginia's history. So many of our tribes have had to go through the secondary process of getting a bill passed through Congress and having the president sign legislation that provides that recognition. And so that's why that Racial Integrity Act was so important to so many of the tribes. In 2010, the state also recognized the Patawomack, the Nottoway, the Cherolinhoka, which I will never say correctly, also got state recognition. And I will say that in one of the years president, I think I have a slide here in a second, Representative Spanberger has also introduced legislation to recognize the Patawomack and get their federal recognition. The Mattaponi, interestingly enough, are still working through the administrative process of doing the Bureau of Indian Affairs administrative process. But in 2018, between 15 and 18, we gained 7 federally recognized tribes, either through the administrative process or through federal legislation. So for me, the important part of this is that between the revision that we did in 2015 of the Wildlife Action Plan and the revision that is due in 2025, we now have 7 federally recognized tribes in the Commonwealth. And once they get their federal recognition, any project in the Commonwealth that has a federal nexus is required to have consultation from the tribes. So they are getting killed with consultation requests at this time. So that kind of brings us up to the present at this point. So where we are at this point is that as of today, the tribes are now trying to buy back their ancestral lands, and this is an interesting process. The Upper Mattaponi, the Monacans, the Nansemons, the Chickahominy, and the Rappahannock have all purchased back large parcels recently in the last few years. Phones Cliff being probably the most well-known one for the Rappahannock, working with the National Wildlife Refuge System. As part of this, they have to find their own funding or grants or other processes in which to find the money to purchase these lands back. So this leads us into the modern story, if you would. There are a couple of court cases that are critically important in terms of determining how the Indian tribes are noticed as sovereign nations. And so I wanted to give you a little background on those, and these are both very recent cases. The Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 was passed because, as most of you remember from your history, there was a period in our American history where Indian children were taken off the reservations, put in religious schools a lot of times, or given away to white families for adoption to basically enculturate them into white culture. In 1978, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act to give the tribes preference in where those children could be placed, and no longer could they be removed from the reservation without the tribe's permission. In, I believe it was 2019, a case was brought up in Texas where a child had been taken off the reservation, put in protective custody, and adopted by a white family. A tribe sued for that, for violation of the Indian Child Welfare Act, and the Supreme Court ruled on that case in 2023, upholding that the Indian Child Welfare Act was indeed still valid and that the child had to be governed by tribal custom and not by state law. A very interesting case that was recently ruled on was the McGirt versus Oklahoma trial. This seemed like a pretty straightforward case in which a gentleman had been convicted of sex crimes under the state of Oklahoma. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, these were committed on the Creek Reservation, and so the Seminole Nation actually had jurisdiction. However, the state of Oklahoma tried to prove that the reservation lands no longer existed in eastern Oklahoma. However, to dissolve a treaty right, and all of these tribes in eastern Oklahoma were part of the Trail of Tears, and they were given these lands by treaty before Oklahoma was a state, as part of being marched off as part of the Trail of Tears. Oklahoma argued that Congress, when they passed the Allotment Act, which was when they started basically taking reservation land and giving it to individual members of the tribe, and Congress tried to do this in order to break up the tribes and sort of get them out of their reservation lands and give the states more jurisdiction. But however, the treaties that were signed with the Five Nations marched to Oklahoma had never been dissolved by Congress. And to dissolve the nations required another act of Congress, which was never passed. So hence the Supreme Court ruled in 2023 or in 2020 that the tribes actually still have the right and jurisdiction over this particular case, and their reservation lands do still exist. This had wide-ranging consequences far beyond Oklahoma in the grand scheme of tribal nations across the country. So as I mentioned, the tribes are trying to buy back their land now. Most of their lands were lost, mostly by illegal means or in violation of treaties. They have to find their own funding, as I mentioned before. Once the lands are purchased, they are considered like any other private landowner. There is nothing that takes them in any other different form. So they are still subject to real estate taxes under local zoning. They still have to go through local zoning if they want to build something. In order to put those into the sovereign nation or reservation status, they have to register those lands and put them in trust with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And once they are put in trust with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, then they are considered reservation lands and they are exempt from all state and local jurisdiction for that point, for the most part. And there are a lot of exceptions to that, and they're still arguing about a lot of them in court. Once they are enrolled with BIA, however, they are required to get permission from the Bureau of Indian Affairs every time they want to build or timber or do a management plan or do anything with their lands. And interestingly enough, the Virginia tribes that went through the legislative process to get their recognition also signed away their rights to build any casinos in Virginia. So that was part of the legislation that gave them their federal recognition. So there are lots of quirks and nuances to this. So the tribes are now trying to figure out ways to develop revenue streams. The tribes are attempting to do this through a variety of means, casinos being the biggest one. That doesn't work so well in Virginia. Some of them are doing mineral extraction on tribal lands and selling rights for that. Many of them are investing what little funds they have. Some of them are trying to implement taxes on their reservation lands. This is being fought by states because obviously it would be some loss of revenue for the state. Interestingly enough, we saw a presentation recently on some of the tribal lands using carbon credits and conservation easements. This gets really sticky because the tribes lose some amount of land control when they do one of those things. So those get a little sticky when it comes to cultural pieces of this because they don't want to lose control of land that they've just purchased back, obviously. A lot of them are doing sales of authentic native crafts. On the screen, you'll see some of the Monacan and Pamunkey native artifacts that they sell. And some of them are now getting into native seed production, which is another place where our agency may be able to partner with them, and we're really looking at that. And as I mentioned, the states are continuing to challenge in court the tribe's ability to tax and do some of these other things. So a lot of this is still being defined as to what a sovereign nation is in the courts. There are federal grants and other ways that the tribes can get funds to do things, but even these, I hate to say, are tilted against the tribes. And The example I'll give you here is the State Wildlife Grant Program. In 2022, there was 56, or I guess it's fiscal year 23, there was $56 million available in state wildlife grants that was divided up among all the states and territories based on a formula. Virginia's share of that is $1 million a year, approximately. There's also an additional $7.7 million in state competitive wildlife grants that is available for the states to compete for. They get preference for interstate and big cooperative projects for that. But the tribes only have access to $6.2 million in state and tribal wildlife grants, and all 574 federally recognized tribes have to compete for that, which also means they have to have the staff and expertise to write the grant applications. So as you can see, there are still pieces of this that still are not being what you might consider fair. So as I mentioned, there are 574 sovereign tribal nations across the country. They are commonly known as tribes, nations, bands, pueblos, communities, or native villages that all have formal nation-to-nation relationship with the U.S. government. These tribal governments are legally defined as federally recognized. 229 of these are in Alaska. The remaining tribes are located in 35 states. And in total, they currently have in trust enough land that would make them the fourth largest state in the Union if they were all considered one entity. Tribal governments are important and unique, and they are, I see on the slide here, and this is from the National Congress of American Indians site, and it says the U.S. Constitution recognizes them as sovereign governments, just like Canada or California. And the interesting part of the tribes is they are some combination of what a state and a foreign government would be to the United States. Most of this is still being fought over in the courts as to how many rights and how sovereign they can be. So there's a lot of that still being determined. But in most cases, they have the equivalent power of the states. But they also have the ability to speak to other nations should they choose to do that. And they are not required in most cases to work with the state in which they are located if they don't choose to do so. But they do have the ability, much like our governors do. So for instance, Governor Youngkin recently went to Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea, signed an MOU for economic development between Virginia and those countries. The tribes have the absolute same capability of doing so, should they choose to do so. So to get on a more practical level at this point, and some of the things that I've learned, when you enter into a dialogue with the tribes, you are entering into a conversation with a sovereign nation, not just another stakeholder. These folks are different than dealing with the Nature Conservancy or the U.S. Forest Service or one of our other normal stakeholders. So it requires a slightly higher level of formality and diplomacy. When you contact the tribes, it's easier to contact the tribes individually and not just send them a letter or send them an email. They have a tendency to, one, be completely overwhelmed with the workload that they currently have, but they also have a certain level of distrust. In our usual mode of, hi, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you, does not work with the tribes at all, as you might imagine. So when, for instance, we have gotten comments from our stakeholders on the Wildlife Action Plan as we've gone into the process, we send an email back to acknowledge all of the comments to each of the partners and stakeholders. But when the tribes have commented, we have sent them a formal letter and contacted them individually to respond to their comments, because we want them to understand, not that we didn't listen to everybody, but that we want to make a special effort to listen and to let them know that they were heard. Each of them has an address in many cases that is an official title to them. So sometimes you have to do your homework on how they want to be addressed. Ask them what they want. Don't just outline your goals to them. As I mentioned of most of my staff, I said, answer their questions as you would answer a question from the governor's office or a cabinet level position. You may not always be able to do what they want, and we've had this come up already, but it's always good to sit down with them and have a conversation and explain to them why and see where you might be able to meet in the middle. In Virginia's case, 4 of the 7 recognized tribes have 1 paid environmental staff person at this point, and they generally are getting literally hundreds of consultation requests a year to comment on, and so they are basically doing triage. The federal recognition brought this on, so you get the good with the bad, if you will. The tribes still have the ability, even though they are strapped in many cases for monetary funds, they have the ability to bring a significant human capital to bear on projects that are important to them. So I always say, try to find a variety of projects that serve their interest as well as meet your conservation goals as you go into the conversations. In any time you want to work with the tribes, try to bring some resources to the table. One of the things that we've tried to do recently is when we are sampling on the rivers that are within their sort of cultural boundaries. So if we're on the Rappahannock, we will send the Rappahannock tribe a note saying, we are going to be on the Rappahannock doing fish sampling on this day. If you would like to join us, we would love to have you, but just wanted you to know we were going to be in your traditional area. And this has actually worked really well, building some nice relationships with some of the tidal tribes on the rivers. I think they appreciate the fact that we're recognizing sort of their historic ownership of these areas. As I mentioned, the tribes do not have access to the same resources as other state agencies, so try to find ways to provide resources. Assisting the tribes with technical assistance. Many of them are now talking about building hatcheries in Virginia, so we are providing technical assistance in that regard. And we're taking tribal members out and doing training and letting them come sample with us when we're doing aquatic sampling. Wildlife is a cultural resource in our language to the tribes. And I use that term in our language because to the tribes, it is not just a cultural resource. It's not something to just be managed, as we sort of have a way in a scientific realm of thinking about it. We have impacted their culture in ways that we may not think about. So for instance, the Upper Mattaponi had a conversation with one of our biologists about the fact that the shad are a critically important part of their culture. And at the same time, they can no longer eat the shad from the river in any quantity because of health concerns. And in the same vein, box turtles, we may think of box turtles as something really cool, something that, is threatened by the turtle trade. But to many of the tribes, the box turtle symbolizes healing and wisdom, longevity, fertility. There are great pieces in a depth of their culture that these natural resources play into that go well beyond what we think of as managing wildlife. The most important thing you can do when you're working with the tribes is ask them what they want and how they want to respond. When I first started going into conversations and trying to get some feedback from the tribes, I have to admit I took it kind of personally because none of them would respond until I finally sort of cracked the door with the Chickahominy tribe and actually learned what some of the background was, how busy they were, how overwhelmed they were, how few resources they had. And so they are at this point doing what they can. So you kind of have to check your own assumptions at the door. Don't take it personally if they don't respond, and try to, whenever possible, meet with them or talk to them in person on a one-on-one basis, because they seem to appreciate that more and appreciate the respect I think that sort of conveys. Interestingly enough, Oregon sort of started down a new road. They signed an agreement with the Coquille tribe in Oregon to start co-managing fish and wildlife in Oregon in a 5-county region in their traditional areas. And there have been many examples of how states and tribes kind of get crossways with each other because the states want to hold on to authority and the tribes want to exercise their sovereign rights. So you kind of get to loggerheads if you don't start trying to build these relationships very early in the organization of the tribe. And we went down and spent a day with the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, who 20 years ago had a 2-person environmental shop, now has a 27-person environmental shop. And you have to remember that those 27 people do all of the work within the reservation of the koala boundary of Western North Carolina that all of our natural resource agencies in Virginia do. So we have literally thousands of people doing natural resource work in Virginia, and they have 27. So doing basically all the same functions. So one of the things that the Eastern Band of the Cherokee shared with me was try to start building those relationships as the tribes are organizing administratively, because the better relationship and the more communication you have with them early on, they will remember that as they get bigger and more administratively organized. And you will probably cut down on the problems that will develop later if you don't develop those relationships early. Interior Secretary Holland and the Secretary of Agriculture Vilsack issued an executive order, a secretary's order in 2021 that basically said that there would be joint management in many of our areas. This came into play in Virginia when the Rappahannock tribe started to buy land within the boundaries of the Rappahannock Valley, River Valley National Wildlife Refuge. And several parcels that they have now purchased will be co-managed between the tribe and the National Wildlife Refuge. So this is kind of a cool example of how this actually works. And we're actually going up, I think they're having a ceremony on the 25th, where one of the longhouses that is on the Rappahannock River Valley National Wildlife Refuge is being turned over to the Rappahannock tribe. And it's going to be their cultural education center. So it demonstrates how things can work together. I'm going to kind of jump over the next couple of slides just because it's not really as applicable, but it's something to keep in mind as we all move forward in getting to know the tribes and starting dialogue with them. The traditional ecological knowledge is something that has really started to show up in the literature. There are a lot of really cool examples of ways that, because many of the tribes have been observing wildlife over huge long periods of time, they actually have gained an understanding of many of the wildlife resources that we manage and that we are still, collecting data on. And so sometimes we can really gain a lot just by having a conversation with the tribes about a particular species. And of course, we go through what we call adaptive management. We try something, we look up, gain some more data, we try something else, and we come back and evaluate. They use observation over years, decades, or even longer to learn what they're learning. So, like I said, they have something to teach us. And there's some really great examples of this in the literature, and I'll be glad to share some of these with you. But there have been some great examples of how we've been studying things for decades. And then when they had a conversation with some of the tribes, some of the Western tribes, they found out how much they didn't know. So that was kind of a cool example of how the tribes have gained so much knowledge over the years, just through their own culture. And with that, I will open it up to any questions that anybody has. That's sort of my walk through this so far, and I'm open to any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeff. If we have any questions, you can either go ahead and unmute and ask Jeff, put it in the chat, or raise your hand and I'll get to you, however you want to do that. While folks are thinking about that, I do have a question for you, Jeff. So you said that they're trying to organize administratively. We can still see your screen if you want to stop sharing.
There we go.
There you go. So you said they're still organizing administratively with the federal recognition. It means they have to, kind of scramble, because now it's required that any projects have to consult them. Does that halt processes that DWR is doing? Like, if you hadn't built some of these relationships and started contacting them now, would that delay a lot of what DWR could do?
No, the interesting thing is that the federal government basically says we are required to consult with them. If we do not hear from them within 30 days, we are not required to hold our bases. So that's why I say the tribes are primarily just triaging what they can, because what they're doing is they're going through every consultation request they get and seeing if there's by chance any nexus with their cultural resources or otherwise. And if it doesn't seem to have anything that's really important, they don't ever respond at all. And after a certain amount of time, we can keep moving on with the project.
So that has the potential of ignoring the tribes.
Yes.
If they just don't have the resources. Are the resources increasing for them? Are there ways in which they're coping with increasing their staff, increasing their, you talked about the revenue streams, but increasing to actually meet the demands now or down the line?
Very slowly. And as I mentioned to you earlier, the Eastern Band of the Cherokee took 25 years to go from 2 people to 27 people. So you're looking at 1 person a year, basically, that they added to the program to get to where they currently are. Now, of course, the Cherokee sort of had a jump moment where once their casino was built, they suddenly had a very large stream of revenue that started feeding into them. My suspicion, and this is just sort of educated guess at this point, my suspicion is that the Virginia tribes are going to take a lot longer because they're going to have to find sort of smaller ways, unless they can find big ways, big chunks of money that will come in and help them. It's going to take them longer to get organized. The Rappahannock probably is the most organized that we have in Virginia right at the moment. I think they have 5 office staff now that are working with them, along with 1 environmental staff. So that's as far as we've gotten so far in Virginia. But again, as they become, I hate to say more bureaucratic, but that's really what it's going to boil down to in our jargon. As they become more administrative and bureaucratic, we need to make sure that we keep those lines of communication open so that that continues to go back and forth. And I will tell you, there's an example. Albemarle County, the city of Charlottesville, wanted to build a water intake plant in southern Albemarle County, which was going to disturb an ancient burial ground, Rassawick, in southern Albemarle. The Monikins actually stopped that project because it was going to severely impact one of their most important sites. And so there is the potential that if something we are going to do, or any other state agency or federal agency in the Commonwealth is going to do, that has a federal funding mechanism involved, that one of the tribes could step up and put a halt to it, or slow it down significantly, or require some mitigation at some point. So it does have potential, but as of right now, mostly what it is that if they comment, then you just have to stop and read their comments and say, you know, how do we address this?
All right, so Scott says, thanks, Jeff. Can you speak a bit more how the tribal interests and rules interface with state fish and wildlife regulations? Are there challenges there? And if so, how's the agency addressing that?
Oh, there's a really good question. And it's interesting because since in Virginia, we don't yet have any reservation lands except for the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi, which are both about 300 acres, if I remember correctly. It hasn't yet become a real issue, but it probably will become a real issue once the tribes start actually registering their lands with in trust with the BIA, as I mentioned before. Obviously, the tribes, if they are federally recognized, and quite honestly, I've talked to our law enforcement officers, and if anybody says they're a member of a tribe and has any sort of documentation of that, we do not require a hunting and fishing license. So they are exempt in that regard already. And as of yet, it has not come into play. Now, one of the things that we've gotten questions already from the tribes about rebuilding hatcheries or starting hatcheries. So obviously, if the tribe decided to build a hatchery on their property, and wanted to start introducing shad into all the rivers again, you know, for many years, the department had a shad rearing and stocking program, and we stopped that because We determined through our means that there was really no impact on shad populations from all that stocking we were doing. So it was really like throwing money away. But the tribes are all having this thought again about doing this. And we have made it clear to them that we don't really support it, but we won't stand in the way if they want to start a hatchery. And we will support them with technical assistance in any way that we can from our hatchery staff. So there are potential pitfalls here that we could very easily fall into, which is one reason I have been strongly encouraging all of our staff to start those conversations. And I can give you a really great example from the eastern band of the Cherokee. I don't know how many of you realize, but there aren't many white-tailed deer in western North Carolina, which I didn't know. You just assume white-tailed deer are everywhere these days. But when you think about it, there's no real ridge and valley in western North Carolina, so there's no sort of edge habitat. So when you think about it, there's probably not a lot of habitat for white-tailed deer in western North Carolina. So the tribe wanted to reintroduce white-tailed deer into the reservation lands in western North Carolina. So they contacted the state of Ohio and started importing deer from Ohio into western North Carolina. As you can imagine, the state of North Carolina and the National Park Service at Great Smokies was none too happy about this. And so there was a big sort of come to Jesus meeting, if you'll pardon my pun. And they sat down, and what they did was they worked out a deal where the state of North Carolina transported deer from a park that was highly overpopulated with white-tailed deer in Charlotte to the reservation lands, and they were able to continue the reintroduction program, but not by bringing deer from out of state, which obviously brings a whole level of new concerns to it. So those are the kinds of things I really, really want us to be able to avoid, because for all practical purposes, the tribes do not need to ask our permission at this point. So if we don't get into those conversations and start building that trust now, the problems they can create for us could be, monumental.
Great, thank you. Other questions? I have another question. In talking about how to approach sovereign nations, are there any lessons that you're all learning in how we should approach stakeholders in general, rather than, our typical stakeholders are not sovereign nations, of course. And so are there lessons that are going back the other way in how we can better communicate with the various stakeholders in the state besides the sovereign nations?
I know from my point of view, one of the things that we have got to learn, and I think it's generational in many respects, maybe not completely, but I am probably the last of a generation of biologists where we really felt like we knew best. We would tell you what you want. Rather than asking the public of Virginia what's important to them, we would simply keep coming out with things that we were doing because we thought they were the best things to do. We were using the best science available. So we were making a lot of assumptions about, and I use my term again, we're from the government, we know best, and we're here to help you. We have entered a realm of management where that really is not the best practice anymore. We really need to be having more discussions than basically, instead of telling people exactly what we think they want. And that is a real culture change for most of our fish and wildlife agencies.
All right. Ray, did you have a question?
I did. Thank you. Jeff, that was a terrific presentation. I don't know how you ever managed to gather all that information, but it was both informative and frankly eye-opening. I appreciated it very much. I was at Utah State for 20 years. I worked with an awful lot of Native American students there in wildlife and fisheries. And I'm curious if our state agency is making, are you making progress on employing Native American students or students who come from a Native background? I mean, I realize they may not be a real tribal reservation background, but nonetheless a Native American background.
To answer your question, Ray, I won't say that we've had a lot of progress in hiring them. Interestingly enough, we started a program 2 years ago where our agency started doing paid internships every summer for the first time ever. Prior to that, we always made them be volunteer. And the reason we did that was part of our diversity and inclusion plan, because we were trying to get folks that didn't look like the rest of our agency interested in natural resource and wildlife management and bringing them into the fold of the agency, giving them some experience. Interestingly enough, most of the interns that we've been hiring since we started that program are coming from the schools that still have traditional environmental science and wildlife management programs, which means they all still continue to look just like us. So it's a real struggle to do that. Now, the other side of that equation is we have had great success in having several of the tribes go out in doing sampling with us. So my hope is that over the years, if we continue to do that, it's going to, in a sense, be sort of an informal internship where those folks will get interested and then come back, go through some sort of college program in wildlife management or environmental science, or get a degree or get some more experience and want to come back and either work for us or work for the environmental programs in their own tribes, which would be just as valuable at this point. So that's sort of my hope in the fact that in inviting them out and having them go out with us, that we are starting to, if you will say, start that pipeline.
Well, that's a start. That's terrific. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat from Jennifer 7. How many of the current SGCN species are associated with tribal lands currently? I imagine all species have some cultural significance, but similar to the box turtles, is there a knowledge of the particular species that are perhaps more of a priority?
The only educated answer I can give you to that question is shad and river herring. The 6 tidal or river tribes all have a vested interest in shad and river herring, which are already SGCN species, even in the 2015 plan. We have already received comments from a couple of the tribes that want to actually raise the tier ranking in our plan for shad and herring. And we are having a conversation about that now. And so yes, there are certain species that they have certainly made it quite clear are important to them. At this point, thankfully, they have already been species that are already on our list. So I think there's an opportunity there for us to continue to work with the tribes in conservation for those species. Beyond that, I don't have a good feel. We are early in our comment period for our SGCN lists for the Wildlife Action Plan. So I would suspect that we are going to get more comments, especially once the bird list comes out in probably early December. I would suspect some of the tribes are going to have a lot of comments on several of the bird species. We did not get anything on reptiles and amphibians, which surprised me. But again, many of our major reptiles and amphibians, like the box turtle, are already on the list. So it may be that they just saw them and felt like that was good enough. So I don't think that was a great answer, Jennifer, but it's the best I can do right at the moment.
And speaking of staff, how many people do you have working to build these relationships at DWR? Are you seem to be the point person, but are there others that are boots on the ground with this?
The only thing I can tell you is that beyond myself, our Region 1 staff, so our Region 1 manager and our Tidal Rivers project manager, have been doing most of the point contact and doing most of the field work with the tidal tribes, the rivering tribes. So I guess at this point I could say that there are 3 of us, but it is really spotty. And I have done this sort of on my own, simply because I wanted to make sure that we were able to at least engage the tribes and give them the opportunity to comment on the Wildlife Action Plan, since it is a new piece of the revision that is due in 2025. So I wanted to make sure I did a much better job of figuring out how to engage with them. And so I've kind of taken it upon myself to do a lot of this research. To answer Ray's question, I've done a lot of reading, and I went to the State Library of Virginia, and I spent a day with the Cherokee tribe in North Carolina. So it gives you an idea of some of the ways that I have tried to build my own awareness, because I've been very honest when I talk to the tribes. I said, "You're talking to a stupid white guy." I do not know the terminology. If I say something that is wrong, please just correct me. And they seem to appreciate that. They seem to appreciate the fact you come to them with some level of recognizing your own blank spots, if you will. And so I have tried to be very upfront and honest in all of the discussions I've had with the tribes about the fact that I'm coming at this from a really naive standpoint and from a very, white privilege, if you will, point of view. And so I want them to tell me how it is they want to be engaged with, what it is that is important to them, and how best to engage them. And that seems to be working. So I won't say that I've made any major social faux pas so far.
There's no other questions. I think we'll end there. Thank you so much, Jeff, for this really great presentation, getting us all familiar with how to address sovereign nations, and hopefully we can learn that in just our regular daily interactions with each other. I want to note that our next talk is, give me just a second here, on, of course now I can't see, is on November 17th, and that's Dr. Mark Stern from the Department of Forest Resources at Virginia Tech, working with diverse stakeholders, lessons from long-term collaborations and conflicts. So that'll be November 17th at 12 o'clock.
And I just put my contact information in the chat, so if anybody needs it, if anybody has further questions or wants a copy of the presentation or whatever you've got, more than glad to help you with what I know. I do have contacts with all the tribes, so if anybody is in a particular area and wants to contact them, I can provide that as well.
And we will post this recording of this talk with our others in the next several days. Thanks so much, everyone.